All right. I guess we can go ahead and get started. Hopefully we get some more. I know we changed the schedule, but I guess this will be the schedule going forward. So hopefully, and also, I guess we can talk about maybe, or I guess one update was that we talked about doing in-person sessions relatively soon. So I know I'm excited to be able to do something like that. So I'm sure we'll have to work out some kinks and like how it actually will be set up in the library and things like that. But yeah, anyone watching this,
I would say stay tuned for the ones that are watching us or they're gonna be watching later. Stay tuned because there's gonna be a couple changes, but hopefully you guys can still join us and be part of this.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
These sessions.
Yeah, maybe we can even still stream it potentially. Or
yeah, absolutely.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, that's really good to hear. Yeah, I guess I could just Zoom like normal. Anyway, okay. So yeah, we can go ahead and get started. I think I'm ready to go. So just the usual introduction. My name is Page Swanson. I am the kind of like resident coder programmer with the New Haven Free Public Library, the I've Squared group. And we're running this series of workshops on databases, using databases and working with them. This is the 5th session, and it's going to be one of the kind of final sessions where we're sort of wrapping up all of the content that we've kind of looked at so far. And today we're going to try to set up a web page, set up a web server, and then connect to the database that we worked on creating in the past couple of sessions. So this session's a great one to jump in on because you really don't need to know too much about what we've done so far. As long as you have a database file, you can use all of the information I'm presenting today to connect a web page to your database file. So hopefully people find that pretty useful. You can use all of the code I provide today just off the bat if you want to just get started with a website that connects to a database. So start off by just presenting again, like I always do here. This is my GitHub page. This is where I host all of the content for the class. So if you want to follow along, you can go to this page, Library SQL or SQL. You can go to Lessons, and you can go to Session 5 dated for today. It should be up to date. I just updated it not too long ago. And yeah, Celeste, is there anything else you wanted to say before we get going?
I just want to say, well, for the ones that they don't know me, I'm Celeste. I work in ICE Square. I usually co-host these meetings and I help Paige with anything he needs. I just want to remind about the office hours that you have every Monday from 6 to 8. So those so far are going to be continuing online. And again, like we said before, we might switch in person coming up. That would be either August or September. Just stay tuned and we're going to let you know. Yeah.
Great. Yeah. Awesome. Thanks. Yeah, good reminder. I really encourage people to come to these. I mean, I can talk to you about anything, answer any kinds of questions. I'll try to help you out as best I can. You can also send me emails to this address, coder@nhfpl.org, and I can respond to emails there, see your messages, and answer questions that you might have about coding or anything in general. Okay, so what we're going to cover today is pretty basic, like if just talking about it. We're going to make a web page that's empty. It's not really going to have anything on it. We're going to start a web server on our computers. So you'll need to, if you want to follow along completely, of course, you can just be watching on any device. But if you want to actually do the exercises that I'm kind of presenting, then you'll need a laptop computer, like some kind of computer. But it doesn't necessarily need to be connected to the internet if you want to follow along on that device. And then we're going to connect to a SQLite file. So these are the files that we've been working with previously, where we're storing a database inside of a file, and then we're using it to maintain our data. Okay, so the first step, we're going to download and install this tool called Dino. Dino, like Dino. So I've included a link to the tool here inside of the lesson plan. Dino is really a fantastic, what's called a runtime environment for JavaScript. JavaScript is a programming language and typically is associated most closely with the web browser. So like the browser, like Firefox or Internet Explorer or Microsoft Edge or Google Chrome. All of those applications, those browsers, they have their own what's called a JavaScript runtime environment. This environment is designed to like run JavaScript in a pretty uniform way, so that web pages that you visit can give you JavaScript on your computer to run using the browser. So like if you go to a web page like like Wikipedia or all kinds of web pages that might run JavaScript, like Twitter could be another example, something like that. All of these pages need JavaScript in order to operate in a lot of cases. Some pages are what are called static pages. They don't have JavaScript, they just use HTML. Most web pages nowadays use JavaScript. And what Dino does is basically it's a tool that you can download and run JavaScript outside of the browser. So it's called a JavaScript runtime environment. Yeah, it's going to let us do some things like start a web server. So we're actually going to be able to act like a website on our computer. We're going to be able to like make an HTML file and make a web server, and then we can host that HTML file as like a web page just for us, so no one else can go to it. It's just for our computer. So yeah, Dino is really great. It's really, I think it's pretty easy to use, and it's a really interesting way to get started with web programming and JavaScript programming to do all kinds of tasks. You'd be very surprised at what you can accomplish with it. And it lets us run JavaScript anywhere we want, basically. So you will follow these instructions depending on the environment you are using, or like the operating system that you're using. If you're on Windows, you can open PowerShell. All you have to do is just press the Windows key and type in PowerShell, and it'll come up. And you can install it like this. But there's easier ways to do it. You could try Chocolatey. Chocolatey is like a pretty cool tool. There's also this Dino install, it looks like. Oh yeah, okay. This is just a place where it's just keeping a list of all the different ways to install it. So I think if you're on Windows is probably the best way to go, or the most immediate way to go. But yeah, maybe try out one of these because these are generally pretty useful. I'm using Mac. I actually used this application called Homebrew, which if you're using a Mac and you don't have it, I highly recommend it. It's really useful for installing tools. But if you have problems installing stuff, you can contact me outside of this, and I'll try to help you get set up. But otherwise, we'll kind of proceed. This stuff isn't too bad to set up. So if you can get that downloading in the background, if you're following along with this, it might take a little while. So yeah, just be sure to kind of get that going in the background. In the meantime, I've already installed it, so I'm going to proceed to the next step. The next step is going to be creating a database. So the whole point of this kind of tutorial or this workshop is to create a database and create a website that can talk to that database. So with all the knowledge we have about databases from previous sessions, we're going to use all of that to like create a website basically that can load information from our database. This is a really common task. Almost all of the websites I guarantee that you use every day use a database to store information and load information for users to access. So this is a really, really crucial role that websites serve in this day and age. So we're going to try to do a little bit of that. So in some of the previous sessions, we actually put together this nice database script, which makes a database table for us and inserts some sample data. So it's ready to go. So what I'm going to do is just copy the content of the script. I included a link to it right here. I'm going to copy it and close that out. So using this database script. And then we can make the database that we need by just visiting this website. So this is called SQLite Online. I introduced it previously. It's going to let us execute SQL scripts or SQL scripts in this little like console window here. And it'll do exactly what we ask it to do. So in this case, it'll make a table for us with all of this data that we're inserting here. And just to prefix, what you're going to want to do is drop the table on the left hand. So that's to drop this demo table. It's called demo. So just right click it and click drop. That's going to delete this table because we don't want that extra table. We just want our data. And when you load the page, it just comes with that data by default. So I'm going to click run. The page will flash like it did something, and it actually added our table. So it added our table with all this data that we want. And I'm using some of our SQL knowledge from previous lessons for those following along. I can check this table out to see if the data actually made it in there. So I'll select from bottle info and I'll run this. And look, all of our data is present. So we have all of the data that we added in our script. So this is great. So what we're going to do now is we're going to save the file to a location on our computer. So if we click this at the top left here, and we click Save DB, okay, so that's going to make a DB file for us to read later on. So I'm going to click Save, and it's just going to save it to my downloads folder. So that's all we needed to do. So we just used it to basically run our script, create our database table, save the file as a database file, and then we'll use that later. So for now, we'll kind of move on. So the next part, we have our database. It's stored in a file. Now we need a web page. So we want to eventually load a web page that then gets data from our database that we can look at and display to a user. So first things first, or I guess the second thing we're doing, since we already did the database, we're going to need to make a basic HTML file, so just a basic document. So this is a pretty handy link here from the Mozilla Developer Network. And they have this really nice, convenient, like simple document template. This is basically the basics of what you need for an HTML document. You don't need that much more than this. Usually, I think sometimes you typically, it looks like you can find it here too. Maybe they've updated it. I don't know. Yeah, it's the same. Oh, actually they did. Did they add? yeah, that's what I was going to mention, actually. Yeah, usually you want to add the language, which would be right here. But basically, this HTML document consists of HTML code only. So it's saying basically to the browser, when they load your HTML page, it's saying that this is it's an HTML document. It's in the English language, specifically with United States syntax. This would be for like accessibility, like if someone is blind and they use a screen reader, this screen reader will know that this is in the English language, and so all of the content on the page should be interpreted that way. This basically tells it how the content of the page is encoded. So like when I load a web page like this one, for example, github.com, it has its own information indicating what kind of like encoding is used, so that when my browser loads the page, it knows how to read it. This is the title here, so the title is going to be right here, like in the tab. So that's where your title is going to show up. And then this is the body, so this is the content of our web page. This is, yeah, again, like the most basic. This is as basic as you can get. It's just the basic necessities. So we're going to copy these necessities, and we're going to close this out. And what we're going to do is, actually, I think we can just directly download this file. So let's see. Let's go back down to that link. I like this link. It's very nice. Maybe I'll add it, because what I can do is I can just click raw here. And then this will just take me directly to the HTML code. Like there's nothing else on here except for the HTML code that's presented right here. And I can click Save Page As. And this will basically just save the HTML content. And then what I can do is I can go to where I'd like to store the web page. I'm going to put it in my downloads folder, because that's a convenient place to put it. And you can, and that's where my database is anyhow, that database file I downloaded. So you can put it there too. It's totally up to you where you put it, but I'm going to put it there. And I selected all files. And if I click save, uh-oh. Let me, I don't know what the other file that is. Let me delete that other file. Who knows what it is? Okay, I don't think I need it. That's good. Okay, I deleted that file, so now I should be able to save it. Okay, so I saved it, so we can close that. So in the future, what I'll do is I'll just provide a link just to this directly, because this is quite useful. It makes it very clear to see. That's all we need. Okay, so back to our sort of our lesson plan. We downloaded the document, but in order to connect to our database via our web server that we're going to set up, but we need some JavaScript, like I was talking about earlier. So a lot of web pages use JavaScript to do things. So if we're kind of breaking down the simple structure of a web page, you often have HTML, which provides the content for the page, the structure of the page. You have CSS, which you might have heard of. This is going to give like kind of decoration or style for the page, like color and fonts and things like this. And then you have JavaScript, and JavaScript is what the page uses to do things. So if you want to do anything on a web page, if you want to make things happen, you use JavaScript. So that's what we're going to add to our page by including this little script tag. So you can just copy this. And what I'm going to do is open my text editor here. I use this text editor called Atom. I've talked about it before in some previous sessions. Atom is just a pretty basic text editor. It isn't super fancy, but I really like it a lot. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to open my folder, my downloads folder again, and I'm going to go find the file that I just downloaded, this index.html file. I'm going to open it up. Okay. And what I want to do, going back to the lesson here, is we want to add this tag just above the body. So if you go back to the text editor, so the body is right here in this tag. This is called a tag. So we're going to add the script tag right above that. And I didn't format it. We'll fix that. So that's all we need to do for now. This script tag is going to contain all of the JavaScript that we're going to add to connect to the web server. We don't have the web server yet, so we're not going to do anything just yet. But basically, I've added some comments. Basically, this is lines of code that don't do anything, but just comments to the developer, the programmer, the coder. And these basically are just outlining what we're going to be doing. So we're going to make a web request. We're going to connect to the server, which is just our computer. And then we're going to get a response from the server with our database data. So that's what this web page eventually is going to do. That's what the JavaScript on this web page is going to do. So it's just a heads up. So we can save that file and go back to our lesson. I've asked here for you to try to visit this web page that we've just created. So already, even though we've just saved this very simple HTML file with hardly any content, we can already visit this page on our computer. So for myself, if you're following along and you put it in your downloads, the link you're going to use to access that file is going to look very similar. For me, it was file, basically this URL here. I didn't put it in a public folder though, but I'll go ahead and move the file there just to make the example work. So what I'll do is add a new folder, call it public, and I'm going to move the HTML file into that folder. And the reason you typically do something like this is because it kind of separates the content of your web page that you would want to be public, and then everything else which you don't want to produce to like the website that you're hosting. I don't know if that makes a lot of sense, but you don't want the users to access every file that's on your server. So having a public folder like this, I mean, you could call it whatever you want, but having a folder like this, just indicating like these are all the things that I know are exposed to the user. It can be pretty useful to do that. Okay. So now that I put the file in there, I can press enter and I can load this page. And lo and behold, it actually loads the page. So it says, this is my page. This is exactly what we put in here in our text file. If I change this, and I can say, this is still in my page, I can save it. I saved it. If I reload this page, it updates because we changed the web page. So, so we know that this is working. Everything so far is working pretty well. So I'm going to go back to the kind of instructions here and get to the kind of beefy part. So assuming that you got Dino downloaded in the background, this Dino application we talked about previously, you are now ready to set up the web server. So we have a web page, and our goal should be making a web server so that from our web page, we can make requests to the server for information. So what we want to eventually do is have a web page that makes a request to the server, which is on our computer. It says, hey, I would like some data from the database. Can you give it to me? And then the web server will say, yes, I've seen your request. I'm going to respond with data from a database. So we need to set up that web server on our computer so that we can do that. So it turns out that Dino is a really great way to set up a web server. It's very easy. I like it a lot for this purpose. It's very, very simple, and it gets the job done. So I'm a big fan of that. It has this really nice example in the manual. If you go to just Dino manual, it's Dino land, I guess, like a little pun on Dino land, and then /manual. You can get here by going to examples and then clicking HTTP web server. So that's what we want. We want an HTTP web server. That stands for Hypertext Transfer Protocol. So this is going to work as a web server for us. And it's going to be the way that we get our content from our database. But we're not going to start with database content off the bat. We're going to start with something even simpler, which is basically, getting some information about our browser when we try to make requests to the server. So yeah, we're basically we're going to copy this code. That's all we're going to do. And this code here is doing a number of things, but it's doing some important things in particular that I think it's kind of helpful to understand. First of all, it's creating a server that's listening to port 8080. So this is like a port in the networking part of our computer. A port is like our way of accessing information on the network. So we look at different ports to find different types of information that the network might deliver to us. So we're going to make a server, a web server that listens to port 8080. And then we're basically going to log some information to the console here. The console is just like the little viewport that we'll see in a second when we run a command to start our web server. It's going to log information to that window that we use to start it. Then what it's going to do is basically wait for connections on the server to get started. And once those connections are successfully started, we're going to include some code that serves HTTP connections. So we have a port open up here for our web server. We've connected to that port. It's working great. Now what we're going to do is say, for this port, I'd like to kind of send and receive HTTP information. The details of this aren't super necessary at this point, but I'm just trying to help sort of break down what this code is doing. And then what it's going to do is just eternally wait for requests from people reaching the server, specifically HTTP requests. So on this HTTP connection, so for each request event on this HTTP connection, or of this HTTP connection, is kind of how you would read this. And then we're going to do something about those requests. So we're going to respond to those requests. And what we're doing in this particular example is we're getting information about the person making the request and sending it back to them. So it's a very simple request response. It's not anything complicated. It's going to basically open up the content of the request. So request event.request.headers. So in this particular example, we're getting the headers from the request. And we're asking for the user agent, which is basically like information about the browser and the operating system that the person making the request is using. I know all of this is very dense and complicated, but I just kind of want to break down some of this code. The most important part of this, I think, aside from the fact that this is an HTTP connection on our web server, is that we're going to respond to that request. And that's the part that is really crucial for us, because we eventually want to respond with database content. But for now, we're just responding with this simple example. We're basically going to say, hey, for that request, I want to respond with the following. We're going to give back a message saying, this was your user agent, and then this is the status of your request response, which is 200. At 200 means good to go. This request worked out well. We responded successfully. All is good. Okay, so that's the gist of that code. It's a little bit complicated looking, but most of these are comments. So the code is very short. In actuality, it's not that long. So I'm going to copy this. And what I'm going to do is go back to my text editor. I'm going to open a new file. And I'm just going to paste that in. And I'm going to click File, Save As. And what I'm going to do is go to my Downloads folder, where we made that public folder. Okay, but outside of the public folder, because this web server isn't publicly accessible. I don't want it to be publicly accessible. It's just going to run on my computer. And then I'm going to visit my website as as someone else, pretend I'm on the internet and I want to visit this website. I want to only, from that website, I want to only be able to see the public content. So that's why we kind of separate those things. So I'm going to call this webserver.ts because this is a TypeScript file. It's basically a special kind of JavaScript. It's like a superset of JavaScript. Like TypeScript includes JavaScript and some other stuff, but it's not super important. It looks basically like JavaScript. We can kind of treat it like that. So I'm going to save this, and you'll see that my text editor updates the way that this looks and makes it look super nice. It looks much better. It's much easier to kind of observe this way. So that's very nice. And I'm just going to leave this as is, except for I'm going to make a little variable here called the URL. This is a variable. I'm just going to store some information in this variable. And what I'm going to store is this URL specifically, because we're going to need to use it again. We're going to need to be able to reference it again. And I don't want to have to keep typing it out. And then what I'm going to say here is I'll replace this, except I'll reference my variable. And it's OK if you don't know JavaScript, and this doesn't really line up very much, because I'm going to leave you with a file that you can use. And all you'll do is swap in your database. So you'll be good to go, as long as you kind of get the general idea of what's happening here. So we have our URL. We're able to respond to HTTP requests, and we get some information about the user when we respond to them. So I'm going to save this. And I'm going to go back to the lesson. So we're going to follow the example, which we did, create a file with the content. I guess that's a little big. I'll try to fill that in. But the gist is that you're going to create a file with this content here. You can actually use this too. I know it looks a lot simpler, but I do like this example a bit better. Yeah, you could use this too if you prefer. And then what we're going to do is actually copy this command, and we're going to run our first command to start our web server. So surprisingly, that's all we need to do. We copied the code, we pasted it into our editor, we saved it. We're going to copy this command, and we're going to open a terminal application. So if you are using Windows and you downloaded Dino with PowerShell, you're going to paste the following command in PowerShell. If you're using Mac, you're going to do like me, and you're going to paste it into the terminal. Whoops, I'm in the wrong directory. So I have a new terminal tab here. I need to go to a different directory. I'm going to do that by saying CD. So I'm changing my directory in the terminal here. But an easier way to do this on the Mac is just to say CD. Instead, we're going to open Finder, go to Downloads. Okay, and we see our web server here. For some reason, Mac thinks that this is an MPEG file. I don't know why it thinks that, but it's not. And we're going to drag this little icon and just paste it right there. Okay, so now I've changed directories to that location. And then what I'm going to do is close this out and copy this command again. So copy, you can just click this little icon here to copy a command. And we're going to paste it into the terminal, and it's going to start the web server. So it's checking it first to make sure that the code is functional, like that it makes sense, that there's no errors. And then it started the web server. If you notice, if I go back to my text editor, see how we said this console.log line? So HTTP web server running, access it at this URL. So it worked. Like it printed this content, the web server is running. So currently this code is running right now. All this code is running. So from there, the next logical step is to actually try to visit the page produced or provided by the web server, the HTTP connection provided by the web server. So we're going to do that by visiting this link. And it works. So this is our web server. Whoops. It doesn't print anything else because we didn't tell it to. But if I go back to our code, it says that it's going to respond to a request to the server with the following information. So your user agent is, so you can see there, it says your user agent is, and it tells us about ourselves. So it says that we're using Mozilla Firefox. It says that I'm running this version of Macintosh OS X. So that's pretty cool. So we have a functional web server. It's running on our computer. I don't know if we have any questions or anything like that so far. I don't know if we have any questions on Facebook or anything like that.
Yeah, we haven't have any questions, but we do have like about 2 attendees in Facebook, and there were 2 attendees in Zoom. One left, so we have 1 person. But please, if you have any questions, just put them in the chat, and I will be happy to follow up.
Awesome. Yeah, I want to make sure I'm not going too fast, but of course you can hopefully review the recording later because that will be up at some point, and you can try to follow along at that point.
Yeah, I think I will need to do that. Like I've been like following a lot in the previous sessions, but this one I want to make sure I got it. So I will probably
yeah,
later.
I mean, yeah, and I try to provide as many links as possible so that you don't have to worry too much about following like exactly along. You'll always have the instructions here. So definitely, if any of those are missing, by the way, or something I need to include or update, I'll try to do that. So we got our web server working, so that's really great news. And you'll see in your command line, if you're using PowerShell, if you're using Mac, it'll just keep running. Like it's not going to stop. It'll just keep running. So we'll just let that keep running. There's no reason to stop it right now. So what we want to do now with our new web server is we want to make a request to it. So the web server is set up and it's running. So we want to make a request to the web server from our web page. So if you remember our web page here at index.html, we want to make a request to the web server at this URL. Okay, so those are right now, those are 2 separate things. But what we want to do is connect them via a request and a response. So we want to make we want to add some additional JavaScript code to this page in order to do that. So we need to go back to that script tag. So back to the script tag that we added to this page. And we can do so in our text editor. So I'm going to open the text editor back up, hop away from this file for a second and go back to this file. So if you remember the script tag, this is where we're going to make requests to this server that we're talking, or that we're trying to talk to. So what we can do is make some good use of the fetch API. So the fetch API is, it's like an interface, or like a tool, maybe you could say, in JavaScript that lets us make requests, very simple requests, to servers. So we can make web requests, specifically HTTP requests to a web server. And we can handle sending information via the request. And we can also basically handle the response that we get back from that request. So specifically, we're going to make a GET request, which is like the most basic type of request that you can make for the most part, as far as HTTP requests go. This link here, this kind of explains the fetch. This link, the first link, so it explains how it works and concepts behind it. But this link here provides a really nice example, a really good breakdown of the way it works. So that's the second link, javascript.info. So that's actually the example code that I'm going to be using. We could also use example code here, I think. Or maybe it doesn't really have a good example. Yeah, it doesn't have the best example. So that's okay. Well, yeah, so I guess we have to use this. But it does explain it pretty well, so I would still check that out. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to follow along with this example, and we're going to hop down to about here. This is pretty good. I don't think we need much more than this. It does omit some information that I included in the code sample on the website. So I'll kind of do that as I go to kind of fill you in, because you'll get an error if you just copy and paste this code right away. So we need to do something special afterwards. Actually, we're going to get an error anyway. I'll explain how we're going to fix that after this first. So basically, I just copy pasted this code. And what it says is fetch. We're going to wait for the fetch to resolve, basically saying, hey, like the fetch is going to take some time. I don't want to do anything while that's happening. So just await the completion of this fetch. And once you're finished up with that at this particular URL, get the response. And if the response is okay, meaning that it was a 200 actually, well, it's anywhere between 200 and 299. That's what this response part was here, right? Go ahead and get the content from the response, like from the web server, and store it in this variable. There's a couple of things we want to do here, because first of all, we don't really want to restore the response in a variable. Like we don't really care to do that. We just want to print it out immediately. So what we're going to do is two things. First of all, we're going to print it. So we do the same thing that we did here, console.log. We're going to do that on our web page as well. And I'll show you where to view this kind of like information in the console. We'll just say JSON. And actually what we're going to do is we don't even want to see a JSON. You don't have to worry about really what that necessarily is right now. We want to just get text. So basically like just take the garbage that the server sent to us in response to our request, which we made right here. So this is the request. This is the response. So just get text, like just get the text content of the response. We'll rename this variable text. And then what we'll do is just spit that out to the console. In fact, you could do it all in one line of code. And I don't see why not. We don't need to store it as a variable. So this basically will get everything we need. So it'll basically get the feedback from the server, and it'll just print it out to the console, just spit it out. And that's all we really want to do. One thing we're missing, I guess we can just reload the page and we'll see what happens. So when you load this page, which we just edited, we edited the JavaScript for the page. We don't see anything related to the JavaScript we just added. Like there's nothing here. That's because all of that super great JavaScript content is actually going to be in this special window. You can open that by doing a couple things. In Firefox, you can go to Tools, and you can say Web Developer Tools here. You can also typically press F12, and that will open your developer tools. So if I go over to console here, I have a couple of errors that I need to deal with, and that's what I was talking about before. First, it says that await, that keyword that we used, is only valid inside of async functions. So what does that mean? It means we need to do something that's a little bit complicated looking, but it's not too bad. Basically, we need to make all of this code, we need to turn it into an asynchronous function, which means a function that happens asynchronously. So it happens alongside other things. So other things can happen while this happens, if that makes sense. So what we're going to do is use some special syntax here, which, again, you can just copy paste this code for your own project. But if you're interested, basically what I'm doing is I'm wrapping all of this code here in a function. This function takes no parameters, and it's defined within these braces. And then what we're going to do is wrap this function in parentheses because it's an anonymous function, which means that it doesn't have a name. So it doesn't have a name. And then we're going to call it by adding 2 more parentheses here. So it says basically this function with no parameters that's defined within these braces, I would like to call that function when my page loads. That's basically what all of this says. They don't really explain that in this example because they explain it in a previous section. So I wouldn't worry too much about that. But basically, when we load the page, we don't get that error anymore. Instead, we get another error. It says reference error, URL is not defined. So we need to go into our file. So it says, this is basically saying the error is on line 9. So if we go over to line 9, it says URL is not defined. And that makes sense. Like I'm referencing this keyword URL, but I haven't set up the keyword URL. So that URL is actually this thing that I pasted here. Okay, it's the address of our web server. So that's what we're making a request to. So what we want to do is make a request to this URL. So I will add another variable here. I'll say let URL. I can make it a constant too. It doesn't really matter. So we defined this variable called URL, and then we're using it to make a request. So hopefully that makes sense. So what we're going to do now is save that, and we're going to reload this. Okay, now we're all caught up. So the problem is that this doesn't work. And it doesn't work because when we're using our computer like this, it doesn't like that it's trying to access content from basically like a somewhere that it doesn't recognize, as I guess a short way to put it. It kind of explains it here. If you open this error, if you see this error in your console when you load your page, you can click on this learn more. And it'll kind of explain why this is a problem, but it's kind of an annoying problem. But basically what it means is that we need the same server that we're loading this page from to serve or to respond to requests that we make. So if we loaded the page from the server and we make a request to a server, we want the same server to handle that request. It's getting confused because I'm trying to go to my downloads folder to load the page, but then I'm making requests to a different server. That's all kind of semi unimportant right now, but basically what we need to do is we need to fix our web server, which currently just serves this information, doesn't really do anything other than telling us what our user agent is, or our browser and our operating system. We actually want this server URL to serve our test page. So we want to basically hit this and have it load this test page. And then that test page will then go back to the server and say, hey, now that I'm loaded, that's great. I actually want you to do the following, and we'll get it to respond to a request. These links and connections seem a little bit weird, but basically what we're doing is we're making a web server that hosts a website. And that website makes requests to that server, that same server. So there's a server, it gives us a web page. The web page then makes a request back to the server for information, for additional information, like loading data from the database. And then it gets a response from the server, which it then does whatever it wants to with. Hopefully that makes sense. If it doesn't, please come to my office hours. I love breaking these kind of systems down. They're very interesting to me. If you find them interesting too, that's great. But if you don't, and you just want to get the database part, then you can just use the code I've provided on this web page here. You can get right to it. But nonetheless, I'm going to try to fix this problem. So what we want to do is we want to serve the HTML file that we're loading from our downloads page. Instead, we want to serve that at this URL. So what we're going to do is going to open this code file, code editor back up again. And we're going to go here to our web server, and we're going to modify this part of the code, specifically where it handles requests. Okay, so we want to basically, instead of getting this user agent, instead of responding to the user instead of responding to a request for this URL with the user agent, like information about the user, we don't really care about that. Instead, what we want to respond with is our HTML page. So I'm going to paste the code that I included here in this lesson. So you just copy this, and you can just paste it right in. For some reason, it doesn't want to format correctly. I don't know why. Oh, I guess, okay. You just go to the start of the line and then paste it in. So what I've done here is I've added a response pathway. And you can actually delete this code. We don't need this code anymore. So you should be left with this code. So what I've done is I've basically said, hey, when you get a request, stop. Don't just do anything for any old request. Why don't you check the request URL? Check the URL of the request. And if the URL is equal to this URL that I defined at the top, so this is the URL from the request that we're getting here. This is the URL that I have stored. If you get a request that has the following URL, serve this file. What we're going to do is use Dino, our tool that we're using for our web server. We're going to use it to read a file from our computer, specifically the index file that we were talking about earlier. We're going to have it read an index file or index HTML file, and we're just going to send it back to the requester. So they'll request this URL. We'll say, hey, I got your request. I'm going to respond to it by giving you this HTML file. So that's what we're going to do. So we're going to save that. Okay. We're going to go back here. We're going to close this because we don't want to view the page from downloads anymore. We want to view it from our server. And we're going to reload. This didn't change though. Like we're still getting the same information. And the problem is because, if you remember, we left our web server running in the background. So it's still running. We have to stop it and restart it because we updated the code that the server is running from. So I'm going to press Control-C, and that's going to stop the web server. You can also close the tab and reopen it. It's up to you. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to run this, say dino run allow net web server. Okay, click this. Okay, the web server is running. That's great. Running again, and we're going to reload. The problem is that it failed. Why did it fail? Let's find out. Okay, it tells us exactly why it failed. It says, hey, I tried to read your HTML file. I found it, but I don't have access to that. And that's something kind of cool about Dino. Dino prevents you from doing things like connecting to the network on your computer or reading files or writing to files unless you explicitly tell it that I can do that. So like I mentioned in the example, we're going to restart the server, but update the command that we use to run the server to be this. So we're going to allow it to read now. So if it hits an error, it stops automatically. So we can now run it again. Okay, so the HTTP web server is running. Doing great. Let's reload it. Okay, so we've reloaded the web server. And look at that, we get the same thing that we got if we go to the downloads folder. Oops. Let's go to the downloads folder, public, HTML. So notice it's the same HTML. It's the same thing, except here, whoops. We get this cross-origin request blocked. And here we do not. We actually get the HTML content, I guess, because we're logging every request that we make. We're logging the response. So this is what we're getting in response, which is kind of funny. But yeah, so like there's no error about cross-origin requests, and that's good. So I realize I'm at time, but we made it very far. We set up a web server. We set up a web page being served by that web server, and there's really not that much left to do. All we need to do is read the data from the database. So that's all that we had left to do. And we needed to set up a new response from our web server for getting that data. Why don't we use the next session to cover that? And I can cover some more stuff in addition. Maybe we can try to extend the project a little bit. I had some ideas about how we could do that. We could try to like make a request to add data to the database or delete data from the database, things like that. We could try to display the data on our page, because currently when I load the data, I'm just going to spit it out like I'm doing right here in the console. So I'll try to think of what we can do next, or maybe I'll leave it up to anyone tuned in. Maybe I can ask to see what in particular sounds most interesting. But so next time what we'll do is we'll start the class by finishing our web server so that we load data from the database. But we got pretty far, yeah. So we made a web server and it serves a web page, so it's pretty cool. Thanks for joining. I hope it was interesting or pretty cool. But I think it's really cool.
It was pretty cool. I love it.
Awesome. Yeah. one fan. That's good.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Paige. Thank you for everyone watching. And if you couldn't watch it today, maybe later or in another day, it will be in Facebook. And later on, it will be in our YouTube account, Ives Square. Right.
Great.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Okay.